Chapter 7. My first quarter at Lowood seemed an age, and not the golden age either. It comprised an irksome struggle with difficulties in habituating myself to new rules and unwanted tasks. The fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships of my lot, though these were no trifles. During January, February, and part of March, the deep snows and their after melting, the almost impassable roads prevented our stirring beyond the garden walls, except to go to church. But within these limits we had to pass an hour every day in the open air. Our clothing was insufficient to protect us from the severe cold. We had no boots. The snow got into our shoes and melted there. Our ungloved hands became numbed and covered with chilblains, as were our feet. I remember well the distracting irritation I endured from this cause every evening when my feet inflamed, and the torture of thrusting the swelled, raw, and stiff toes into my shoes in the morning. Then the scanty supply of food was distressing. With the keen appetites of growing children, we had scarcely sufficient to keep alive a delicate invalid. From this deficiency of nourishment resulted an abuse, which pressed hardly on the younger pupils. Whenever the famished great girls had an opportunity, they would coax or menace the little ones out of their portion. Many a time I have shared between two claimants the precious morsel of brown bread distributed at tea time, and relinquishing to a third half the contents of my mug of coffee, I swallowed the remainder with an accompaniment of secret tears, forced from me by the exigency of hunger. Sundays were dreary days in that wintry season. We had to walk 2 miles to Brocklebridge Church, where our patron officiated. We set out cold. We arrived at church colder. During the morning service, we became almost paralyzed. It was too far to return to dinner. An allowance of cold meat and bread, in the same penurious proportion, observed in our ordinary meals. We served round between the services. At the close of the afternoon service, we returned by an exposed and hilly road where the bitter winter wind, blowing over a range of snowy summits to the north, almost flayed the skin from our faces. I can remember Miss Temple walking lightly and rapidly along our drooping line, her plaid cloak, which the frosty wind fluttered, gathered close about her, and encouraging us by precept and example to keep our spirits, march forward, and, as she said, like stalwart soldiers. The other teachers, poor things, were generally themselves too dejected to attempt the task of cheering others. How we longed for the light and heat of a blazing fire when we got back. But to the little ones, at least, this was denied. Each hearth in the schoolroom was immediately surrounded by a double row of great girls, and behind them the younger children crouched in group, wrapping their starved arms in their pinafores. A little solace came at tea time in the shape of a double ration of bread, a whole instead of a half slice, with the delicious addition of a thin scrape of butter. It was the hebdomadal treat to which we all looked forward from Sabbath to Sabbath. I generally contrive to reserve a moiety of this bounteous repast for myself, but the remainder I was invariably obliged to part with. The Sunday evening was spent in repeating by heart the church catechism and the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of St. Matthew, and in listening to a long sermon read by Miss Miller, whose irrepressible yawns attested her weariness. A frequent interlude of these performances was enacted by the part of Eutychus by some half-dozen of little girls, who, overpowered with sleep, would fall down, if not out of the 3rd loft, yet off the 4th form, and be taken up half dead. The remedy was just to thrust them forward into the center of the schoolroom and oblige them to stand there still till the sermon was finished. Sometimes their feet failed them, and they sank together in a heap. They were then propped up with the monitor's high stools. I have not yet alluded to the visits of Mr. Brocklehurst, and indeed the gentleman was from home during the greater part of my first month after my arrival, perhaps prolonging his stay with his friend, the Archdeacon. His absence was a relief to me. I need not say that I had my own reasons for dreading his coming, but come he did at last. One afternoon, I had been there 3 weeks at Lowood. As I was sitting with a slate in my hand, puzzling over a sum in long division, my eyes, raised in abstraction to the window, caught sight of a figure just passing. I recognized almost instinctively that gaunt outline, and when, 2 minutes after, all the school teachers included rose en masse, it was not necessary for me to look up in order to ascertain whose entrance they greeted. The long stride measured the schoolroom, and presently beside Miss Temple, who herself had risen, stood the same black column which had frowned on me so ominously from the hearth rug of Gateshead. I now glanced sideways at this piece of architecture. Yes, I was right. It was Mr. Brocklehurst, buttoned up in a surtout and looking longer, narrower, and more rigid than ever. I had my own reasons for being dismayed at this apparition. Too well I remembered the perfidious hints given by Miss Reed about my disposition, etc. The promise pledged by Mr. Brocklehurst to apprise Miss Temple and the teachers of my vicious nature. All along, I had been dreading the fulfillment of this promise. I had been looking out daily for the coming man, whose information respecting my past life and conversation was to brand me as a bad child forever. Now there he was. He stood at Miss Temple's side. He was speaking low in her ear. I did not doubt he was making disclosures of my villainy, and I watched her eyes with painful anxiety, expecting every moment to see its dark orb turn on me a glance of repugnance and contempt. I, too, listened, and as I happened to be seated quite at the top of the room, I caught most of what he said. Its import relieved me from immediate apprehension. "I suppose, Miss Temple, the thread I bought at Lowood would do. It struck me that it would be just the quality for calico chemises. And I sorted the needles to match. You may tell Miss Smith that I forgot to make the memorandum of the darning needles, but she but she shall have some papers sent in the weeks. She is not on my account to give out more than one at a time to each pupil, and if they have more, they are apt to be careless and lose them. Oh, ma'am, I wish the woolen stockings were better looked to. When I was here last, I went into the kitchen garden and examined the clothes on the drying line. There were a quantity of black hose in a very bad state of repair. From the size of the holes in them, I was sure they had not been well mended from time to time. He paused. Your directions shall be attended to, sir, said Miss Temple. And ma'am, he continued, the laundress tells me some of the girls have cleaned 2 clean tuckers in a week. It is too much. The rules limit them to 1. I think I can explain that circumstance, sir. Agnes and Catherine Johnston were invited to take tea with some friends at Lowood last Thursday. I gave them leave to put on clean tuckers for the occasion. Mr. Brocklehurst nodded. Well, for once it may pass, but please not to let this circumstance occur too often. And there is another thing which surprised me. I find in settling accounts with the housekeeper that a lunch consisting of bread and cheese has been twice served out to the girls during the past fortnight. How is this? I looked over the regulations and I find no such meal as lunch mentioned. Who introduced this innovation and by what authority? I must be responsible for the circumstance, sir, replied Miss Temple. The breakfast was so ill prepared that the pupils could not possibly eat, and I dared not allow them to remain fasting till dinner time. Madam, allow me an instant. You are aware that my plan to bringing up these girls is not to accustom them to habits of luxury and indulgence, but to render them hardy, patient, self-denying. Should any little accidental disappointment of the appetite occur, such as the spoiling of a meal, the under and the overdressing of a dish, the incident ought not to be neutralized by replacing some more delicate the comfort lost, thus pampering the body and obviate. It ought to be improved to the spiritual edification of the pupils by encouraging them to evince fortitude under temporary privation. A brief address to those occasions would not be mistimed, wherein a judicious instructor would take the opportunity of referring to the sufferings of the primitive Christians, to the torment of the martyrs, to the exhortations of our blessed Lord himself, calling upon his disciples to take up their cross and follow him, to his warnings that man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, to his divine consolation, if ye suffer hunger or thirst for my sake, happy are ye. Oh, ma'am, when you put bread and cheese instead of burnt porridge into these children's mouths, you may indeed feed their vile bodies, but you little think how you starve their immortal souls. Mr. Brocklehurst paused again, perhaps overcome by his feelings. Miss Temple had looked down when he first began to speak to her, but she now gazed straight before her, her face naturally pale as marble, appearing to be assuming also the coldness and fixity of that material, especially her mouth closed as if it would have required a sculptor's chisel to open it, and her brow settled gradually into petrified severity. Meantime, Mr. Brocklehurst, standing on the hearth with his hands behind his back, majestically surveyed the whole school. Suddenly, his eye gave a blink, as if it had met something that either dazzled or shocked its pupil. Turning, he said in a more rapid accent than he had hitherto used, Miss Temple, what? What is that girl with the curled hair? Red hair, ma'am, curled all over. And extending his cane, he pointed to the awful object, his hand shaking as he did so. It is Julia 7, replied Miss Temple very quietly. Julia 7, ma'am. And why has she, and any other, curled hair? Why, in defiance of every precept and principle in this house, does she conform to the word so openly, here in an evangelical charitable establishment, as to wear her hair a mass of curls? Julia's hair curls naturally, returned Miss Temple, still more quietly. Naturally, yes, but we are not to conform to nature. I wish these girls to be children of grace, and why that abundance? I have again and again intimated that I desire that hair should be arranged closely, modestly, plainly. Miss Temple, that girl's hair must be cut off entirely. I'll send the barber tomorrow, and I see others who have far too much of the excrescence. That tall girl, tell her to turn round. Tell all the first form to rise up and direct their faces to the wall. Miss Temple passed her handkerchief over her lips, as if to smooth away an involuntary smile that curled. She gave the order, however, when the first class could take in what was required of them. They obeyed. Leaning a little back on my bench, I could see the looks and grimaces with which they commented on this maneuver. It was a pity Mr. Brocklehurst could not see them too. He would perhaps have felt that whatever he might do with the outside of the cup and platter, the inside was further beyond his interference than he imagined. He scrutinized the reverse of these living metals for 5 minutes, then pronounced sentence. These words fell like a knell of doom. All those top knots must be cut off. Miss Temple seemed to remonstrate. Madam, he pursued, I have a master to serve whose kingdom is not of this world. My mission is to My mission is to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh, to teach them to clothe themselves with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair and costly apparel. And each of the young persons before us has a string of hair twisted in plaits, which vanity itself might have woven. These, I repeat, must be cut off. Think of the time wasted, of... Mr. Brocklehurst was here interrupted. 3 visitors, ladies, now entered the room. They ought to have come a little sooner to have heard his lecture on dress, for they were splendidly attired in velvet, silk, and furs. The 2 younger of the trio, fine girls of 16 and 17, had gray beaver hats, then in fashion, shaded with ostrich plumes, and from the underbrim of this graceful headdress fell a profusion of light tresses, elaborately curled. The elder lady was enveloped in a costly velvet shawl, trimmed with ermine, and she wore a false front of French curls. These ladies were differentially received by Miss Temple, Miss and Mrs. Brocklehurst, as Miss and Mrs. Brocklehurst, and conducted to seats of honor at the top of the room. It seems they had come in a carriage with their reverend relative and had been conducting a rummaging scrutiny of the room upstairs while he transacted business with the housekeeper, questioned the laundress, lectured the superintendent. They now proceeded to address divers remarks and reproofs to Miss Smith, who was charged with care of the linen and the inspection of the dormitories. But I had no time to listen what they said. Other other matters called off and enchained my attention. Hitherto, while gathering up the discourse of Mr. Brocklehurst and Miss Temple, I had not, at the same time, neglected precautions to secure my personal safety, which I thought would be effected if I could only elude observation. To this end, I had sat well back on the form, while seeming to be busy with my sum, had held my slate in such a manner to conceal my face. I might have escaped notice, had not my treacherous slate somehow slipped my hand, and falling with an obtrusive crash, directly drawn every eye on me. I knew it was all over. And as I stood up to pick up the 2 fragments of slate, I rallied my forces for the worst. It came.
"A careless girl,"
said Mr. Brocklehurst, and immediately after,
"Ah, it is the new pupil, I perceive."
And before I could draw breath,
"I must not forget I have a word to say respecting her."
Then aloud, and how loud it seemed to me,
"Let the child who broke her slate come forward."
Of my own accord, I could not have stirred. I was paralyzed. But the 2 great girls who sit on each side of me set me on my legs and pushed me toward the dreaded judge. And then Miss Temple gently assisted me to his very feet, and I caught her whispered counsel. "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident. You shall not be punished." The kind whisper went to my heart like a dagger. Another minute, and she will despise me for a hypocrite, thought I, and an impulse of fury rang against Reed, Brocklehurst and company, bounded in my pulses at the conviction. I was no Helen Burns.
"Fetch the stool,"
said Mr. Brocklehurst, pointing to a very high one from which a monitor had just risen. It was brought.
"Place the child upon it."
And I was placed there. By whom? I don't know. I was in no condition to note particulars. I was only aware that they had hoisted me up to the height of Mr. Brocklehurst's nose, that he was within a yard of me, and that a spread of shot orange and purple silk pelisses, and a cloud of silvery plumage extended and waved below me. Mr. Brocklehurst hemmed. "Ladies," said he, turning to his family, "Miss Temple, teachers, and children, you see this girl?" Of course they did, for I felt their eyes directed like burning glasses against my scorched skin.
"You see she is yet young. You observe she possesses the ordinary form of childhood. God has graciously given her the shape that He has given all of us. No single deformity points her out as a marked character. Who would think that the evil one had already found a servant and agent in her? Yet, such, I grieve to say, is the case." A pause, in which I began to study the palsy of my nerves, to feel that the Rubicon passed, that the trial, no longer to be shirked, must be firmly sustained. "My dear children," pursued the black marble clergyman with pathos, "this is sad, a melancholy occasion, for it becomes my duty to warn you that this girl, who might be one of God's own lambs, is a little castaway. Not a member of the true flock, but evidently an interloper and an alien. You must be on your guard against her. You must shun her example. If necessary, avoid her company. Exclude her from your sports. Shut her out from your converse. Teachers, you must watch her. Keep your eyes on her movements. Weigh well her words. Scrutinize her actions. Punish her body to save her soul. If, indeed, such salvation is possible. For my tongue falters while I tell it. This girl, this child, the native of a Christian land, worse than Mary, a little heathen who says its prayers to Brahma and kneels before Juggernaut. This girl is a liar.
Now came a pause of 10 minutes, during which I, by this time in perfect possession of my wits, observed all the female Brocklehursts produce their pocket handkerchiefs and apply them to their optics, while the elderly lady swayed herself to and fro, and the two younger ones whispered, "How shocking!" Mr. Brocklehurst resumed.
This I learned from her benefactress, from the pious and charitable lady who adopted her in her orphan state, reared her as her own daughter, and whose kindness, whose generosity, the unhappy girl repaid with an ingratitude so bad, so dreadful, that at last her excellent patroness was obliged to separate her from her own young ones, fearful lest her vicious example show fearful lest her vicious example should contaminate their purity. She is sent here to be healed, even as the Jews of old sent their diseased to the troubled pool of Bethesda. And teachers, superintendent, I beg of you not to allow the waters to stagnate around her.
With this sublime conclusion, Mr. Brocklehurst adjusted the top button of his surtout, muttered something to his family, who rose, bowed to Miss Temple, and then all the great people sailed in state from the room. Turning at the door, my judge said,
"Let her stand half an hour longer on that stool, and let no one speak to her during the remainder of the day."
There was I, then, mounted aloft. I, who had said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle of the room, was now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were, no language can describe, but just as they all rose, stifling my breath and contradicting my throat, a girl came up and passed me. In passing, she lifted her eyes. What a strange light inspired them. What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me. How the new feeling bore me up. It was as if a martyr, a hero, had passed a slave or victim and imparted strength in the transit. I mastered the rising hysteria, lifted up my head and took a firm stand on the stool. Helen Burns asked some slight question about her work of Miss Smith, was chidden for the triviality of the inquiry, returned to her place, and smiled at me as she went by. What a smile! I remember it now, and I know that it was the effluence of fine intellect, of true courage. It lit her up. Marked lineaments, her thin face, her sunken gray eye, like a reflection from the aspect of an angel. Yet at that moment Helen Burns wore on her arms the untidy badge. Scarcely an hour ago, I had heard her condemned by Miss Scatcherd to the dinner of bread and water on the morrow, because she had blotted an exercise in copying it out. Such is the imperfect nature of man. Such spots are there on the disk of the clearest planet, and my eyes like Miss Scatcherd's can only see the minute defects, and are blind to the full brightness of the orb. Chapter 8. Ere the half-hour ended, 5 o'clock struck, school was dismissed, and all were gone into the refectory to tea. I now ventured to descend. It was deep dusk. I retired into a corner and sat down on the floor. The spell by which I had been, so far supported, began to dissolve. The reaction took place, and soon so overwhelming was the grief that seized me, I sank prostrate on the floor, with my face to the ground. Now I wept. Helen Burns was not here. Nothing sustained me. Left to myself, I abandoned myself, and my tears watered the boards. I had meant to be so good, and to do so much at Lowood, to make so many friends, to earn respect and win affection. I had made visible progress that very morning. I had already made visible progress. That very morning, I had reached the head of my class. Miss Miller had praised me warmly. Miss Temple had small approbation. She had promised to teach me drawing, to let me learn French. If I continued to make similar improvement 2 months longer, then I was well received by my fellow pupils, treated as an equal by those of my own age, and not molested by any. Now, here, I lay again crushed, and trodden on. And could I ever rise more? Never, I thought, and ardently wished to die. While sobbing out this wish in broken accents, someone approached. I started up again. Helen Burns was near me. The fading fires showed her coming up the long vacant room. She brought my coffee and bread. "Come, eat something," she said, but I put both away from me, feeling as if a drop or a crumb would have choked me in my present condition. Helen regarded me, probably with surprise. I could not now abate my agitation, though I tried hard. I continued to weep aloud. She sat down on the ground near me, embraced her knees with her arms, and rested her head upon them. In that attitude she remained silent as an Indian. It was I who first spoke. "Helen, why do you stay with a girl whom everyone believes to be a liar?" "Everybody, Jane? Why, there are only 80 people who have heard you called so, and the word contains hundreds of millions." What have I to do with millions? The 80 I know despise me." "Jane, you are mistaken. Probably not one in the school either despises nor dislikes you. Many, I'm sure, pity you much." "How can they pity me after what Mr. Brocklehurst said?" "Mr. Brocklehurst is not a god, nor is he even a great and admired man. He is seldom liked here. He never took steps to make himself liked. Had he treated you as an especial favorite, you would have found enemies, declared or covert, all around you. As it is, the greater number would offer you sympathy if they dared. Teachers and pupils may look coldly on you for a day or two, but friendly feelings are concealed in their hearts, and if you persevere in doing well, these feelings will ere long disappear, so much the more evidently their temporary suppression. Besides, Jane. She paused. "Well, Helen?" I said, putting my hand into hers. She chafed my fingers gently to warm them, and went on. "If all the world hated you, and believed you wicked, while your own conscience approved you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends." "No. I think I know I should think well of myself. That is not enough. If others don't love me, I'd rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here. To gain some real affection from you or Miss Temple, or from any whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand beneath a kicking horse and let it dash its hoof at my chest." "Hush, Jane. You think too much of the love of human beings. You are far too impulsive, vehement. The sovereign hand that created your frame and put life into it has provided you with other resources than your feeble self, and then creatures around you. Besides this earth and besides the race of men, there is an invisible world and a kingdom of spirits. That world is around us, for it is everywhere. And those spirits watched us, for they are commissioned to guard us. And if we were dying, in pain and shame, if scorn smote us on all sides and hatred crushed us, angels see our tortures, recognize our innocent. If innocent we be, and I know you are of this charge which Mr. Brocklehurst is weakly pompously repeated at second hand from Miss Reed, for I read a sincere nature in your ardent eyes and your clear front, and God waits only the separation of spirit from flesh to crown us with full reward. Why, then, should we ever sink overwhelmed with distress, when life is so soon over and death is so certain an entrance to happiness, to glory?" I was silent. Helen had calmed me, but in the tranquility she imparted there was an alloy of inexpressible sadness. I felt the impression of woe as she spoke, but I could not tell whence it came, and when, having done speaking, she breathed a little fast and coughed a short cough, I momentarily forgot my own sorrows to yield to a vague concern for her. Resting my head on Helen's shoulder, I put my arms round her waist. She drew me to her. We reposed in silence. We had not sat long thus when another person came in. Some heavy clouds, swept from the sky by the rising wind, had left the moon bare, and her light streaming in through the window near shone full both on us and on the approaching figure, which we at once recognized as Miss Temple. I'm trying to remember the voices I gave for everyone. I think Miss Temple I gave a lower voice. I came on purpose to find you, Jane Eyre, she said. I want you in my room, and as Helen Burns is with you, she may come too. We went, following the superintendent's guidance, and we had thread some intricate passages, a mount, staircase, before we reached her apartment. It contained a good fire and looked cheerful. Miss Temple told Helen Burns to be seated in a low armchair on one side of the hearth, she herself taking another, and she called me to her side. "Is it all over?" she asked, looking down at my face. "Have you cried your grief away?" "I'm afraid I shall never do that." "Why?" "Because I have been wrongly accused, and you, ma'am, and everybody else will now think me wicked." "We shall think what you prove yourself to be, my child. Continue to act as a good girl, and you will satisfy us." "Shall I, Miss Temple?" "You will." she said, passing her arm around me. "And now, tell me who is the lady whom Mr. Brocklehurst called your benefactress?" "Miss Reed, my uncle's wife. My uncle is dead and he left me to her care." "She did not, then, adopt you of her own accord?" "No, ma'am. She was sorry to have to do it. But my uncle, as I have often heard the servants say, got her to promise before he died that she would always keep me." "Well, now, Jane, you know, or at least I will tell you, that when a criminal is accused, he is allowed to speak in his own defense. You have been charged with falsehood. Defend yourself to me, as well as you can. Remember whatever your memory suggests is true, and add nothing, and exaggerate nothing." I resolved, in the depth of my heart, that I would be most moderate, most correct, and having reflected a few minutes in order to arrange coherently what I had to say, I told her all the story of my sad childhood. Exhausted by emotion, my language was more subdued than it generally was when it developed that sad theme, and mindful of Helen's warnings against indulgence of resentment, I infused into the narrative far less of gall and wormwood than ordinary. Thus restrained and simplified, it sounded more credible. I felt as I went on that Miss Temple fully believed me. In the course of the tale, I had mentioned Mr. Lloyd as having come to see me after the fit, for I never forgot the, to me, frightful episode of the Red Room, in detailing which my excitement was sure, in some degree, to break bounds, for nothing could soften my recollection the spasm of agony which clutched my heart when Miss Reed spurned my wild supplication for pardon, and locked me a second time in the dark and haunted chamber. I had finished. Miss Temple regarded me a few minutes in silence, then said, "I know something of Mr. Lloyd. I shall write to him. If his reply agrees with your statement, you shall be publicly cleared from every imputation. To me, Jane, you are clear now." She kissed me, and still keeping me at her side, where I was well contented to stand, for I derived a child's pleasure from the contemplation of her face, her dress, her one or two ornaments, her white forehead, her clustered and shining curls and beaming dark eyes. She proceeded to address Helen Burns. "How are you tonight, Helen? Have you coughed much today?" "Not quite so much, I think, ma'am." "And the pain in your chest?" "It is better." Miss Temple got up, took her hand and examined her pulse, then returned to her own seat. As she resumed it, I heard her sigh low. She was pensive a few minutes. Then, rousing herself, she said cheerily, "But you two are my visitors tonight. I must treat you as such." She rang her bell. "Barbara," she said to the servant, who answered, "I have not yet had tea. Bring the tray and place cups for these two young ladies." And a tray was soon brought. How pretty to my eyes did the china cups and bright teapot look, placed on a little round table near the fire. How fragrant was the steam from the beverage, and the scent of the toast, of which, however, I, to my dismay, for I was beginning to be hungry, discerned only a very small portion. Miss Temple discerned it too. "Barbara," she said, "can you not bring a little more bread and butter? There's not enough for 3. Barbara went out. She returned soon. "Madam, Miss Harden says she only sent up the usual quantity." Miss Harden, to be it observed, was the housekeeper, a woman after Mr. Brocklehurst's own heart, made up of equal parts whalebone and iron. "Ah, very well," returned Miss Temple. "We must make do, Barbara, I suppose." And as the girl withdrew, she added, smiling, "Fortunately, I have it in my power to supply deficiencies for this one." Having invited Helen and me to approach the table and placed before us each a cup of tea with one delicious but thin morsel of toast, she got up, unlocked a drawer, and taking from it a parcel wrapped in paper, disclosed presently to our eyes a good-sized seed cake. "I meant to give each of you some of this to take with you," she said. "But as there is so little toast, you must have it now." She proceeded to cut slices with a generous hand. We feasted that evening as on nectar and ambrosia, and not the least delight of the entertainment was the smile of gratification with which our hostess regarded us, as we satisfied our famished appetites with the delicate fare she liberally supplied. Tea over, and the tray removed, she again summoned us to the fire. We sat one on each side of her. Now a conversation followed between her and Helen, which it was indeed a privilege to be admitted to hear. Miss Temple had always something of serenity in her air, of state of mind, of refined propriety in her language, which precluded deviation into the ardent, the excited, the eager, something which chastened the pleasure of those who looked at her and listened to her by a controlling sense of awe, and such was my feeling now. But as to Helen Burns, I was struck with wonder. The refreshing meal, the brilliant fire, the presence and kindness of her beloved instructress, or perhaps more than all these, something in her own unique mind had roused her powers within her. They woke, they rekindled. First they glowed in the bright tint of her cheek, which till this hour I had never seen but pale and bloodless. Then they shone in the liquid luster of her eyes, which had suddenly acquired a beauty more singular than that of Miss Temple's. A beauty neither of fine color nor long eyelash nor penciled brow, but of meaning, of movement, of radiance. Then her soul sat on her lips, and language flowed. From what source I cannot tell. As a woman of 14, a heart large enough, vigorous enough to hold the swelling spring of pure, full, fervid elegance. Such was the characteristic of Helen's discourse on that, to me, memorable evening. Her spirit seemed hastening to live within a very brief span as much as many live during a protracted experience. They conversed of things I had never heard of nations and times past, of countries far away, of secrets of nature discovered and guessed at. They spoke of books, how many they had read, what stores of knowledge they possessed. Then they seemed so familiar with French names and French authors, but my amazement reached its climax when Miss Temple asked Helen if she sometimes snatched a moment to recall the Latin her father had taught her, and taking a book from the shelf, bade her and construe a page of Virgil. And Helen obeyed, my organ of veneration expanding at every sounding line. She had scarcely finished ere the bell announced bedtime. No delay can be admitted. Miss Temple embraced us both, saying, as she drew us to her heart, God bless you, my children. Helen, she held a little longer than me. She let go more reluctantly. It was Helen her eye followed to the door. It was for her she a second time breathed a sad sigh. For her, she wiped a tear from her cheek. On reaching the bedroom, we heard the voice of Miss Scatcherd. She was examining drawers and had just pulled out Helen Burns's. And when we entered, Helen was greeted with sharp reprimand and told that tomorrow she would have half a dozen of untidily folded articles pinned to her shoulder. My things were indeed in shameful order, murmured Helen to me in a low voice. I intended to have them arranged. I forgot. Next morning, Miss Scatcherd wrote in conspicuous characters on a piece of pasteboard the word slattern and bound it like phylactery round Helen's large, mild, intelligent, and benign-looking forehead. She wore it till evening, patient, unresentful, regarding it as a deserved punishment. The moment Miss Scatcherd withdrew for afternoon school, I ran to Helen, tore it off, and thrust it into the fire. The fury of which she was incapable had been burning in my soul all day long, and tears, hot and large, had continually been scalding my cheek, for the spectacle of her sad resignation gave me an intolerable pain at heart. About a week subsequently to the incidents above narrated, Miss Temple, who had written to Mr. Lloyd, received his answer. It appeared that what he said went to corroborate my account. Miss Temple, having assembled the whole school, announced that inquiry had been made into the charges alleged against Jane Eyre, and that she was most happy to be able to pronounce her completely cleared from every imputation. The teachers then shook hands with me and kissed me, and a murmur of pleasure ran through the ranks of my companions. Thus relieved of a grievous load, I from that hour set to work afresh, resolved to pioneer my own way through every difficulty. I toiled hard. My success was proportionate to my efforts. My memory, not naturally tenacious, improved with practice. Exercise sharpened my wits. In a few weeks, I was promoted to a higher class. In less than 2 months, I was allowed to commence French and drawing. I learned the first tenses of the verb I don't speak French, and sketched my first cottage, whose walls, by the by, outrivaled the slope those of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. On the same day, that night on going to bed, I forgot to prepare an imagination the Barmecide supper of hot roast potatoes, or white bread and new milk, with which I was wont to amuse my inward cravings. I feasted instead on the spectacle of ideal drawings, which I saw in the dark. All the work of my own hands, freely penciled houses and trees, picturesque rocks and ruins, sipe-like groups of cattle, sweet paintings of butterflies hovering over unblown roses, of birds picking at ripe cherries, of wrens' nests enclosing pearl-like eggs, wreathed about with young ivy sprays. I examined, too, in thought, the possibility of my ever being able to translate currently a certain little French storybook, which Madame Pierrot had that day shown me. Nor was that problem solved to my satisfaction ere I fell sweetly asleep. Well, as Solomon said, better is a dinner of herbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hatred therein. I would not now have exchanged Lowood, with all its privations, for Gateshead and its daily luxuries. But the privations, or rather the hardships of Lowood lessened. Spring drew on. She was indeed already come, The frosts of winters ceased. Its snows were melted, its cutting winds mutilated. My wretched feet, flayed and swollen to lameness by the sharp air of January, began to heal and subside under the gentler breathings of April. The nights and mornings no longer by their Canadian temperature froze the very blood in our veins. We could now endure the play hour passed in the garden. Sometimes on a sunny day it began even to be pleasant and genial, and greenness grew over those brown beds which, freshened daily, suggested the thought that hoped traversed them at night and left each morning brighter traces of her steps. Flowers peeped out amongst the leaves, snowdrops, crocuses, purple auriculas, the golden-eyed pansies. On Thursday afternoons and half-holidays, we now took walks and found still sweeter flowers opening by the wayside, under the hedges. I discovered, too, that a great pleasure, an enjoyment which the horizon only bounded, lay all outside the high and spiked garden walls of our garden. Spiked guarded walls of our garden. This pleasure consisted in the prospect of noble summits girdling a great hill hollow, rich in verdure and shadow, in a bright beck full of dark stones and sparkling eddies. How different had this scene looked when I viewed it laid out beneath the iron sky of winter, stiffened in frost, shrouded in snow, when mists as chill as death wandered to the impulse of east winds along those purple peaks, the hill downing and holm till they blended with the frozen fog of the beck. The beck itself was then a torrent, turbid and curbless. It tore asunder the wood and sent a raving sound through the air, often thickened with wild rain or whirling sleet. For the forest on its banks, that showed only ranks of skeletons. April advanced to May. A bright, serene May it was, days of blue sky, placid sunshine, and soft western or southern gales filled up its duration. And now, vegetation matured with vigor. Lowood shook loose its tresses. It became all green, all flowery. Its great elm, ash, and oak skeletons were restored to majestic life. Woodland plants sprang up profusely in its recesses. Unnumbered varieties of moss filled its hollows and made it strange, ground sunshine out of the wealth of its wild primrose plants. I have seen their pale gold gleam in overshadowed spots like scatterings of the sweetest luster. All this I enjoyed often and fully, free, unwatched, and almost alone. For this unwanted liberty and pleasure, there was a cause, to which it now becomes my task to advert. Have I not described a pleasant site for a dwelling when I speak of it as bosomed in hill and wood, and rising from the verge of a stream? Assuredly, pleasant enough. But whether healthy or not is another question. That frost dell where Lowood lay was the cradle of fog and fog-bred pestilence, which, quickening with the quickening spring, crept into the orphan asylum, breathed typhus through its crowded schoolroom and dormitory, and ere May arrived, transformed the seminary into a hospital. Semi-starvation and neglected cold had predisposed most of the pupils to receive infection. 45 out of the 80 girls lay ill at one time. Classes were broken up, rules were relaxed. The few who continued well were allowed almost unlimited license. Because the medical attendant insisted on the necessity of frequent exercise to keep them in health, and had it been otherwise, no one had leisure to watch or restrain them. Miss Temple's whole attention was absorbed by the patients. She lived in the sick room, never quitting it except to snatch a few hours' rest at night. The teachers were fully occupied with packing up and making other necessary preparations for the departure of those girls who were fortunate enough to have friends and relations able and willing to remove them from the seat of contagion. Many, already smitten, went home only to die. Some died at the school and were buried quickly and quietly, the nature of the malady forbidding delay. The disease had thus become an inhabitant of Lowood, and death its frequent visitor. While there was gloom and fear within its walls, while its rooms and passages steamed with hospital smells, the drug and pastille, striving vainly to overcome the effluvia of mortality. That bright May shone unclouded over the bold hills and beautiful woodland doors. Its garden, too, glowed with flowers. Hollyhocks had sprung up tall as trees. Lilies had opened. Tulips and roses were in bloom. The borders of the little beds were gay with pink thrift and crimson double daisies. The sweet briars gave out morning and evening, their scent of spice and apples. These fragrant treasures were all useless for most of the inmates of Lowood, except to furnish now and then a handful of herbs and blossoms to put in a coffin. But I, and the rest who continued well, enjoyed fully the beauties of the scene and season. They let us ramble in the wood like gypsies. From morning to night, we did what we liked, went where we liked. We lived better, too. Mr. Brocklehurst and his family never came near Lowood now. Household matters were not scrutinized into. The cross housekeeper was gone, driven away by fear of infection. Her successor, who had been matron at the Lowton dispensary, unused to the ways of her new abode, provided with a comparative liberality. Besides, there were fewer to feed, the sick could eat little, our breakfast bins were better filled. When there was no time to prepare a regular dinner, which often happened, she would give us a large piece of cold pie or a thick slice of bread and cheese, and this we carried away with us to the wood, where we each chose the spot we liked best and dined scrumptiously. My favorite seat was a smooth, broad stone, rising white and dry from the very middle of the beck, only to be got at by wading through the water. A feat I accomplished barefoot. The stone was just broad enough to accommodate comfortably another girl and me. At that time, my chosen comrade, one Mary Ann Wilson, a shrewd, observant personage, whose society I took pleasure in, partly because she was witty and original, and partly because she had a manner which set me at ease. Some years older than I, she knew more of the world and could tell me many things I liked to hear. With her, my curiosity found gratification, to my faults, as she also gave ample indulgence, never imposing curb or rein on anything I said. She had a turn for narrative, I for analysis. She liked to inform, I liked to question, so we got on swimmingly together, derived much entertainment, if not much improvement, from our mutual intercourse. And where, meantime, was Helen Burns? why I did not spend these sweet days of liberty with her. Had I forgotten her, or was I so worthless as to have grown tired of her pure society? Surely the Mary Ann Wilson I have mentioned was inferior to my first acquaintance. She could only tell me amusing stories and reciprocate any racy and pungent gossip I chose to indulge in, while, if I had spoken truth of Helen, she was qualified to give those who enjoyed the presence of her converse a taste of far higher things. True, reader, and I knew and felt this, though I am a defective being, with many faults and few redeeming points. Yet I never tired of Helen Burns, nor ever ceased to cherish for her sentiment of attachment as strong, tender, and respectful as any other animated my heart. How could it be otherwise when Helen, at all times, under all circumstances, evinced me for a quiet and faithful friendship? Ill humor never soured, nor irritation ever troubled. But Helen was ill at present. For some weeks she had been removed from my sight to I knew not what room upstairs. She was not, I was told, in the hospital portion of the house with fever patients. Her complaint was consumption, and not typhus. And by consumption I, in my ignorance, understood something mild, which time and care would be sure to alleviate. I was confirmed in this idea by the fact of her once and twice coming down the stairs on a very warm, sunny afternoon, and being taken by Miss Temple into the garden, but on these occasions I was not allowed to go and speak to her. I only saw her from the schoolroom window, then not distinctly, for she was much wrapped up and sat at a distance under the veranda. One evening, in the beginning of June, I had stayed out very late with Mary Ann in the wood. We had, as usual, separated ourselves from the other and wandered far, so far that we lost our way, and had to ask at a lonely cottage where a man and woman lived, who looked after a herd of half-wild swine that fed on the mast in the wood. When we got back, it was after moonrise. A pony which we knew to be the surgeon was standing at the door. Mary Ann remarked that she supposed someone must be very ill, as Mr. Bates had been sent for at that time of the evening. She went into the house. I stayed behind a few minutes to plant in my garden a handful of roots I'd dug up in the forest, and which I feared would wither if I left them till morning. This done, I lingered yet a little longer. The flowers smelt so sweet as the dew fell. It was such a pleasant evening, so serene, so warm. The glowing west promised so fairly another fine day on the morrow. The moon rose with such majesty in the grave east. I was noting these things and enjoying them as a child might, when it entered my mind, as it had never done before. How sad to be lying on a sick bed, to be in danger of dying. This world is pleasant. It would be dreary to be called from that, and to have to go who knows where. Then my mind made up its first earnest effort to comprehend what had been infused into concerning heaven and hell. For the first time, it recoiled, baffled, and for the first time glancing behind on each side and before it, I saw all round an unfathomed gulf. It felt the one point where it stood, the present. All the rest was formless cloud and vacant depth, and it shuddered at the very thought of tottering and plunging amid the chaos. While pondering this new idea, I heard the front door open. Mr. Bates came out, and with him was a nurse. After she had seen him mount his horse and depart, she was about to close the door, but I ran up to her. "How is Helen Burns?" "Very poorly," was the answer. Is it her Mr. Bates has been to see?
Yes.
And what does he say about her?
He says she'll not be here very long.
This phrase, uttered in my hearing yesterday, would have only conveyed the notion that she was about to be removed to Northumberland, to her own home. I should not have suspected that it meant she was dying, but I knew instantly now. It opened clear on my comprehension that Helen Burns was numbering her last days in this world, and that she was going to be taken to the region of spirits, if such region there were. I experienced the shock of horror, then the strong thrill of grief and a desire, a necessity to see her. I asked in what room she lay.
She's in Miss Temple's room, said the nurse.
May I go to speak with her?
Oh, no, child. It is not likely. Now it is time for you to come in. You'll catch a fever if you stop out when the dew is falling.
The nurse closed the front door. I went in by the side entrance, which led to the schoolroom. I was just in time. It was 9 o'clock, and Miss Miller was calling the pupils to bed. It might have been 2 hours later, probably near 11, when I, not having been able to fall asleep, and deeming from the perfect silence of the dormitory that my companions were all wrapped in profound repose, rose softly, put on my frock over my nightdress, and without shoes, crept from the apartment and set off in quest of Miss Temple's room. It was quiet at the other end of the house, but I knew my way, and the light of the unclouded summer moon entering here and there at passage windows enabled me to find it without difficulty. An odor of camphor and burnt vinegar warned me that I came near the fever room, and I passed its door quickly, fearful lest the nurse who sat up all night should hear me. I dreaded being discovered and sent back, for I must see Helen. I must embrace her before she died. I must give her one last kiss, exchange with her one last word. Having descended a staircase, traversed a portion of the house below, and succeeded in opening and shutting without noise 2 doors, I reached another flight of steps. As I mounted, and then just opposite to me was Miss Temple's room. A light shone through the keyhole from under the door, and through under the door. A profound stillness pervaded the vicinity. Coming near, I closed the door slightly. I found the door slightly ajar, probably to admit some fresh air into the close abode of sickness, disposed to hesitate, and full of impatient impulses, soul and senses quivering with keen throes. I put it back and looked in. My eye sought Helen and feared to find death. Close by Miss Temple's bed, half covered with its white curtains, there stood a little crib. I saw the outline of a form under the clothes, but the face was hid by the hangings. The nurse I had spoken to in the garden sat in the easy chair, asleep. An unsnuffed candle burnt dimly on the table. Miss Temple was not to be seen. I knew afterwards that she had been called to a delirious patient in the fever room. I advanced, then paused by the crib. My hand was on the curtain, but I preferred speaking before I withdrew it. Still, I recoiled at the dread of seeing a corpse. "Helen?" I whispered softly. "Are you awake?" She stirred herself, put back the curtain, and I saw her face, pale, wasted, but quite composed. She looked so little changed that my fear was instantly dissipated. "Can it be you, Jane?" she asked, in her own gentle voice. "Oh," I thought, "she's not going to die. They're mistaken. She could not speak and look so calmly if she were." I got onto her crib and kissed her. Her forehead was cold and her cheek both cold and thin, and so her hand and wrist, but she smiled as of old. "Why are you come here, Jane? It's past 11 o'clock. I heard it strike some minutes since." "I came to see you, Helen. I heard you were very ill, and I could not sleep till I had spoken with you." "You came to bid me goodbye, then? You were just in time, probably." "Are you going somewhere, Helen? Are you going home?" "Yeah. Yes, to my long home. My last home." No, Helen." I stopped, distressed. While I tried to devour my tears, a fit of coughing seized Helen. It did not, however, wake the nurse. When it was over, she lay some minutes exhausted, and she whispered, "Jane, your little feet are bare. Lie down and cover yourself with my quilt." I did so. She put her arm over me and I nestled close to her. After a very long silence, she resumed, still whispering, "I am very happy, Jane, and when you hear that I am dead, you must be sure, and not grieve. There's nothing to grieve about. We all must die one day, and the illness which is removing me is not painful. It is gentle and gradual. My mind is at rest. I leave no one to regret me much. I only have a father, and he is lately married, and will not miss me. By dying young, I shall escape great sufferings. I have not qualities or talents to make my way very well in the world. I should have been continually at fault. But where are you going to, Helen? Can you see? Do you know?" "I believe. I have faith. I'm going to God." "Where is he? Where is God? What is God?" "My maker, and yours, who will never destroy what he created. I rely implicitly on his power, confide wholly in his goodness. I count the hours till that eventful one arrives, which shall restore me to him, reveal him to me." "You're sure, then, Helen, that there is such place as heaven, and that our souls can get to it when we die?" "I am sure there is a future state. I believe God is good. I can resign my immortal part to him without any misgiving. God is my father. God is my friend. I love him. I believe he loves me." "And shall I see you again, Helen, when I die?" "You will come to the same region of happiness, be received by the same mighty universal parent, no doubt, dear Jane." Again, I questioned, but this time only in thought. Where is that region? Does it exist?" And I clasped my arms closer round Helen. She seemed dearer to me than ever. I felt as if I could not let her go. I lay my face hidden on her neck. Presently she said the sweetest tone, "How comfortable I am. The last fit of coughing has tired me a little. I feel as if I could sleep. But don't leave me, Jane. I like to have you near me." "I'll stay here, I'll stay with you, dear Helen. No one shall take me away. Are you warm, darling? Yes. Good night, Jane. Good night, Helen. She kissed me, and I her, and we both soon slumbered. When I awoke, it was day. An unusual movement roused me. I looked up. I was in somebody's arm. The nurse held me. She was carrying me through the passage back to the dormitory. I was not reprimanded for leaving my bed. People had something else to think about. No explanation was afforded then to my many questions. But a day or two afterwards, I learned that Miss Temple, on returning to her own room at dawn, had found me laid in the little crib, my face against Helen Burns' shoulder, my arms around her neck. I was asleep, and Helen was dead. Her grave is in Brocklebridge churchyard. For 15 years after her death, it was only covered by a grassy mound, but now a gray marble tablet marks the spot inscribed with her name and the word resurgam.